Mike Rusk from the NOAA Office of Aquaculture has come to join us. He has a very amazing and robust background. I was reading from Peace Corps, decades of marine aquaculture research. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read it, but he is based in Seattle and was very generous to come down here and join us for the day as we kind of launch our exploration into aquaculture and to set us off in a smart trajectory. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. A little bit about me. I'm the science advisor for the NOAA's Office of Aquaculture. Technically, I'm based in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., but my condition on taking that job was that I didn't have to move to Washington, D.C., so I live in Seattle, north of Seattle, and most of the time I telecommute. I did my research career in Seattle at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, working on marine fish, primarily rockfish, lingcod, many things that are familiar here. Have had numerous collaborations up and down the Pacific Coast with good friends at Oregon State, so I feel like I'm at home here talking to you. I am the second string here. Laura Holbrecht is the Regional Aquaculture Coordinator. She's located in our Seattle Sandpoint office, and she does policy, regulatory issues, and my job really is to have one foot in the science and one foot in the policy and try to bridge those gaps. It's a lot of taking science and making it understandable for a 6-year-old, which is basically our political regime these days. So with that, I guess I'm in charge, so let me move forward. As Al Haig said. Oh. Okay, so why aquaculture? And this is really going to be mostly a seafood story. If you look at, on a worldwide basis, world capture fisheries versus aquaculture, world capture fisheries are flat. There's really not room for them to increase. The U.S. has very robust management for the wild capture, but we can't go up above MSY and make it sustainable. Right now, more seafood comes from farms than it comes from the wild capture, and you can see the purple in that graph, how that's increasing, while the blue in that graph is the capture fishery, which is fairly stable. The other thing is, as Americans, it's about health. We do not eat enough seafood in this country. This graph is from the latest dietary guidelines for Americans put out by HHS and USDA. The blue bars, it's hard to see, but I'll just kind of describe it. On the right is the female graph, and it's divided in years. So the young people are to the left, and the older people are to the right. The blue bars are what we should be eating. The yellow dots are what we actually do eat, and the males on the left, you can see, are also the yellow dots are way below the blue bars. In the dietary guidelines, which considers everything Americans eat, seafood was the only thing that all ages, both sex, underconsume, and we underconsume that by about 50%. So if you're really trying to get up to dietary guidelines, you should be eating 2 cell phone-sized pieces of fish or seafood a week. So start eating those cell phones. The only other area where men didn't consume enough was fruits and vegetables, but the ladies were doing fine. So seafood is fairly unique in that we underconsume that. From the U.S. standpoint, we import roughly 9 out of every 10 pounds of fishery products. Creates a deficit. That deficit just keeps getting bigger, which concerns folks in Washington, D.C. A lot of that import is from China and Southeast Asia, which obviously has some geopolitical consequences. This is just another way of saying the same thing. Most of what we eat in this country is aquacultured and imported. So this is a little bit old now. So what about a domestic marine aquaculture, and what does why would we want to do that, and what's NOAA's role? First, aquaculture in this country, especially in the marine environment, is really regulated by a series of environmental laws. There's not an overarching aquaculture law like there is the Magnuson-Stevens Act for fisheries. Instead, we have things like the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Magnuson-Stevens variety of food safety and so on and so forth. A lot of those acts impact NOAA's responsibility in terms of stewardship. So that's kind of where we insert into the equation. The other area is these economic benefits. NOAA does sit in the Department of Commerce, and there is an Aquaculture Act of 1980, which basically says agencies go forth and do good. It's not very specific, but it does bring up and provide a hook for this economic development side. Seafood security, I just showed the import-export numbers. In this case, and reducing the seafood deficit are things that we hear a lot about. In this case, Americans are not food insecure. We can buy our food, but we are what we would call nutritionally insecure, and that is, nutritional security deals with the quality of food as much as the quantity of calories. So things like omega-3 fatty acids we're deficient in, and a number of other things that are either rich in seafood or are only found in seafood. So how do we get there? So a couple of policies, the DOC aquaculture policy. This was developed during the Obama administration, and the purpose of at the DOC level is to support the development of sustainable aquaculture within the context of DOC goals, and this brings up the economic growth and employment opportunities, and so on and so forth, competitiveness, and so on. NOAA also redid its aquaculture policy in the Obama years, and it's very similar. It enabled the development of sustainable marine aquaculture. I think in this case it points a little bit more toward the multiple stewardship mission, and as well as the broader social and economic goals. And these policies basically stemmed from ocean policy and higher level policies within the administration that were more ocean in general, and then interpreted for aquaculture. So we have a strategic plan, the Office of Aquaculture, and the vision is a robust U.S. marine aquaculture sector that creates jobs, provides sustainable seafood, and supports healthy oceans. So this really is a nod to a triple bottom line in that we want economic benefits, we want environmental benefits, and we want social benefits. A mission is to provide science, services, and policies, support significant expansion and sustainability of U.S. marine aquaculture. And we have a goal by 2020 to expand volume by 50%. And this was, I think this was 2016, 15, maybe when this came out, 2015, I think. So, this is kind of more of the same, enabling domestic production, creating opportunities, supporting working waterfronts, healthy ecosystems, and then we also have a portion of our aquaculture portfolio toward restoring and enhancing marine species, such as these endangered white abalones in California, for example. Also restoration of things like the Olympia oyster, bull kelp, a number of other species on the restoration side. We are run as a program cross-line offices, which is fairly unique in that the Office of Aquaculture does sit in the National Marine Fisheries Service, but we work very closely with Sea Grant at the national level, which sits in the Ocean and Atmospheric Research Branch, as well as the National Ocean Service, working closely with NCOS and others on some of the marine spatial planning, marine spatial analysis tools. Under NIMS, we also have bricks and mortar science centers, such as the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, which has a lab in Newport, as well as several in Washington State. And then the regional offices. And in each regional office, we have an aquaculture coordinator. Their job is basically to be an ombudsman for all things regulatory and permitting, and to be a link to the science as well as management. Talk a little bit about some of this. The budget. So aquaculture is a tiny program, part of the, this is just National Marine Fisheries Service funding. We're about 1% Most of the money goes into managing wild capture fisheries, protected resources, habitat, and other. In real dollars, and this is not just National Marine Fisheries Service, but this includes OARC grant. And I don't have the latest numbers on here, but the National Marine Fisheries Service portion is a little over, around $11 million. Oh, it's up to 14. It was 11, now it's up to 14. Sea Grant is actually now over $10 million. They had a bump up from that 9.5. And NCOS, which is NOS, is a little less than $1 million going to them. So it's not a big program. We've gone up a little bit recently, and I'll get to that. We're seeing in the more recent budgets increases that have strings attached to them. In other words, we got a $3 million bump up, but we're being required now to spend $4 million on oysters and fees and genetics. So we're seeing that'll come in. I think before we were too small for anybody to care about, and now micromanagement must be an indication of our newfound importance. All right, I'm really reading a little bit into it. A lot of stuff is, there's a lot of stuff going on currently. There's changing roles in federal waters. We've had 2 fishery management plans, one in Hawaii and one in the Gulf. Both of them went through the courts. The one in the Gulf was decided against us. They said that aquaculture is not fishing. The one in Hawaii said aquaculture is fishing. So we have a couple of different opinions based on different courts. We also have been introduced last year and likely introduced again this year, the Aqua Act by Senator Wicker. And the Aqua Act basically would take and make NOAA the lead for aquaculture regulation in the EEZ, and it would fund research. So it wouldn't necessarily be an allocation, but it would allocate up to, I think, $60 million for research instead of the paltry sum we have now, which would be good. And then it also clarifies some of this, the issue of NOAA and regulating in the EEZ, which would make the Magnuson court cases moot at that point in time instead of a framework. So what are we seeing around the country? There is definitely, I would say in the last 2 years, an uptick in interest as measured by permit applications, both in federal waters and relatively deep state waters. We're seeing projects going in the Gulf of Mexico. We're seeing that are primarily finfish for Seriola, yellowtail. We're seeing sighting for steelhead and striped bass off of New England. In California, we're seeing increased interest in shellfish as well as Seriola off of Southern California, Hawaii, and in state waters, Alaska all of a sudden has just turned around. They're going full forward with what they call a mariculture initiative, and we're seeing, I don't know, 7 or 8 new farms growing seaweed and shellfish in Alaska. Likewise in Maryland and Virginia, we've been seeing 7 to 10% growth in the shellfish industry there. So around the country, there's a lot going on with aquaculture. And I think it just speaks to kind of the drivers that I pointed to in the first part of the presentation. Demand. So just to kind of go around the country, what's going on in those places in the greater Atlantic region, oysters and mussels, more interest in offshore type mussels. Clams are a staple. Maine has a very stable growing salmon industry. It's probably growing about 3% a year. There's new interest in scallops there. Seaweed farms in the Atlantic region have gone from 1 to about, I'm going to say about 18 or 19. They keep popping up in the last 4 or 5 years. And we have anchoring in the greater Atlantic region the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Milford, which is our chief shellfish lab for the U.S. The Southeast, also with oysters. A lot of that is coming from funds from BP to try to rebuild shorelines and provide mitigation for the oil spill. There's clams, and then there are a few, two projects trying to grow finfish that are just getting started. And then there's a number of, and I didn't mention this for the Northeast, but the Department of Energy is funding a number of experimental sites to look at seaweed production, eventually to try to look at biofuels from seaweeds. But they're funding 5 projects around the country. They also, incidentally, have a call for proposals out now to look at seaweed as a way to mitigate for eutrophication and potentially ocean acidification. So if anybody's interested, that's out there. Keep on moving. Alaska, I already mentioned this. They're going crazy with seaweeds and shellfish. I think there's now about 5 shellfish farms, and the largest seaweed farm now just got permitted in the U.S. Up in Alaska, Kodiak Island. They've been doing king crab enhancement work up there. They've also worked on scallops, and there's a company up there making noodles out of seaweed that's got a couple farms too. Pacific Islands, 2 areas. Most of the shellfish industry has their hatcheries in Hawaii. It's a biosecure area where you can grow a lot of algae. So a lot of West Coast oysters that we enjoy right here in Oregon have their beginnings in Kona. There's renewed interest in rebuilding and re-establishing the ancient Hawaiian fish ponds, some of these dating back 3,000 years. There's a lot of groups that are now taking on refurbishing these for traditional ceremonial growing of fish. And then the offshore, really the pioneer in offshore fish farming is off of Kona. It's not in federal waters, but it's in very deep waters, because that happens in Hawaii. It gets very deep very quickly. And they've been growing cereal, a yellowtail there for going on 15 years now. West Coast, we're known for our oysters. The West Coast also is the largest aquaculture producing region. Total in the U.S. production is about $1.5 billion worth. We have a number of ports on the West Coast, primarily in California, Humboldt, for example, San Diego, Ventura, that are looking at pre-permitting areas off of their coasts and providing shore-based facilities which could then be utilized to service these offshore areas, primarily for mussels. One project also for finfish, some interest in seaweeds as well. I think that's for a plastic alternative, a biodegradable plastic is what that company wants to do. And also we have the Southwest Fisheries Science Center down there, which is very good at genomics work. They do a lot of genomics work on abalone in support of the white abalone program, as well as Seriola, and some other things with Mexico, Catawba, and other things as well. And Oregon and Washington. So these were slides that were just kind of given to me, so I'm just going to skip through this. Commercial finfish in Washington, just to the north, both Atlantic salmon and steelhead. Although Atlantic salmon is coming to an end, there is steelhead, a large steelhead farm up on the Columbia River. It's the finfish sector is about a $50 million annual industry up there, employing 200 people. There was a net pen collapse a year and a half ago in Puget Sound, which led to the Washington state banning non-native species. That industry is now looking at native species instead, so we'll see where that goes. And then there's also work, the state was in the middle of revamping its state guidelines for siting of marine fish farms, and this was an area we were helping through the National Ocean Service, as well as Northwest Fisheries Science Center had input into those siting guidelines. Shellfish is really the big industry here, almost $200 million. Oysters, clams, mussels. 2,700 people employed, so it's a big part of the Northwest, as you all know. We have a few things emerging. Seaweed, the seaweed project in Puget Sound got started with a Paul Allen grant, and its intent was to look at whether you could create a ocean acidification halo using a seaweed farm to provide, to sweeten up the waters and protect the habitat that would be, in this case, growing oysters underneath. There's a companion project in Maine that's doing the same thing. Seems to be a lot of interest in there and in that and promise. There's work on sea cucumbers. The purple hinge rock scallop is something which is very popular off of our coast. That's still in the research phase. It is not really going commercial. And then there's work on sablefish in Washington State, maybe as one of the species that replaces the outgoing Atlantics, along with Pacific salmon. So there's cucumbers, there's purple hinge rock scallops, and there's sablefish. Okay. I mentioned restoration and enhancement. We don't need to mention Pacific salmon. Everybody has probably heard too much about salmon hatcheries in this room. Olympia oysters, pinto abalone, bull kelp are all three being looked at the Manchester Research Station with Puget Sound Restoration Fund as restoration species. And then I'm not sure what that other part was she had in mind. Okay, so permitting. So the reason we have aquaculture coordinators in each region is because the permitting is inevitably a very long and disjointed process for folks. And this was a result of the Washington Shellfish Initiative, where they mapped out all the hands that had to touch a shellfish permit in the state of Washington. And you can see that there's a lot of people involved, a lot of steps. A lot of this was repetitive. So the idea was to map this out to see whether they couldn't make something which was a little bit more effective at getting to the answer. From a science perspective, one of the things we want to do is we want to understand what the person in each one of those boxes needs in order to make intelligent decisions. And so we spend a lot of our research dollars on what I'll just call tools for rules. In other words, can we embed science in decision-making tools so that the person in those boxes are making consistent, intelligent decisions, the same way every day, objectively, rather than seeing an application and not really knowing what to do with it. These last three slides I wasn't going to talk about. They relate to the Oregon Shellfish Initiative, and I think these were put together by Gil Sylvia at Oregon State, and these were provided by my colleague Laura Hobrecht, who's our regional aquaculture coordinator. So I don't really know a lot about what's going on here, but there may be people in this room that do, possibly from Sea Grant or elsewhere. But I just put it in here. I'll say one thing about this Shellfish Initiative, because we started this about 7 or 8 years ago. We decided to focus and highlight shellfish. The shellfish industry was interested in this. And we started a national shellfish initiative just to really try to bring folks' attention to the role of shellfish, both the ecosystem services they provide, as well as the economic opportunity they provide, and that has spawned a number of state shellfish initiatives. Probably the first one was in Washington State. There's been very successful state shellfish initiatives now in Florida, Louisiana, Connecticut, Maryland, Virginia, California is not so successful, but they have one. So this seems to have replicated itself. So I just want this to be informal, high level. I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. One question I have for you is that you are the chair of the joint NOAA-USDA initiative for options on feed for aquaculture.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you mention how that may touch down on the West Coast or what implications it may have?
Yeah, so my expertise at the Northwest Science Center was in nutrition and feeds. That initiative actually, I believe, was concluded in about 2012. And at the time, a lot of the feed for carnivorous marine fish was based on fish meal and fish oil. And there was a desire to try to see whether there were alternatives. And so we convened with USDA, who also have an interest in fish nutrition, a panel, two panels really, one of fish nutritionists and one of stakeholders. And we came back with a number of recommendations which were published 7 or 8 years ago. And the first one I think is the most important one, and that is that there is no requirement for fish meal or fish oil in diets for carnivorous fish. And that has since, if you follow the kind of what's going on in the feed industry, it's since spawned a number of new feed ingredients for finfish, to the point now where fish meal and fish oil is not the dominant ingredient anymore. Diets are minimally fish meal and fish oil. And then the changes in the fish meal, fish oil portion has been dramatic as well, in that most of the stocks that are being fished for fish meal are now going more and more, not entirely, but slowly, more and more into food grade products, and less of the fish meal component is coming from directed fisheries, while at the same time, more and more of the fish meal that's being produced is coming from the heads and guts and trimmings of food for human consumption. So in the time from when that report was published till now, that proportion of fish meal that comes from heads and guts has gone from about 18, 19% to about 30%, and that's continuing. A couple years ago, if you look at salmon, for example, they went from being a net fish user to a net fish producer. So that whole dynamic has changed. It's to the point now where industry has taken it and run with it. There was recently a group that had a fish meal free challenge, like one of these things that, the company that sold the most feed with no fish in it won $150,000 or something. And there were 6 or 7 companies that went into it, and it was won by a company in China. So that is just continuing to get better and better, to the point where we're actually backing off of research on just trying to replace fish meal and fish oil.
That's interesting news. Thank you. So we're going to go John, Shelby, Richard, Karen, and then I can hear the phone. Is there anyone on the phone?
Nobody's raised their hands.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mike, can you tell us about the sablefish? It was on your list.
Yeah. Specifically, what would you like to know?
Well, I didn't know they're either growing them.
Yeah.
That's a consideration.
Yeah, it's a species which grows very fast. It has a good market. It has a limited wild capture fishery. It has a very difficult early life stage. So the real bottlenecks are making the babies into something that looks like a fish. But that has been overcome. There is a tribe in Washington State that is looking at growing some of these as a tribal farm on Straits of Juan de Fuca. It's right now they're just kind of exploring it, but they do have a sea grant to investigate the economics and the grow-out potential for that.
Would that be the Macaw tribe?
No, it's Jamestown Sklallam.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So just a couple things. One is, I think it's been really remarkable seeing the continued federal investment in aquaculture over the past few years. I was just looking at what has been put into the National Sea Ran Office base, and it was $4.5 million in FY14. It's $12 million this year, and so it's a steady increase in terms of availability of funds, and certainly seeing that from the NIMS perspective as well. Sea Grant side, we have seen annually these federal funding opportunities rolling out. This year there were 3, which makes things a little challenging because of course they were impacted by the federal shutdown, and so they're trying to get everything out the door and then back in the door. But really striving to increase a lot of capacity within the Sea Grant programs along the lines of aquaculture. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and maybe Karen will hit on this as well, is with respect to the Shellfish Initiative. It may not have been completely adopted. As we saw, I think there were maybe 3 actions that were taken. But there are other groups that are looking at the recommendations that have come out of that, like the OAH Coordinating Council, and seeing where there are intersections between what they recommended and where we can look at things from an OAH perspective, which is also really good.
Right. Yeah, I like to say Congress decided to take our budget from minuscule to tiny. But you reminded me, there are 3 Sea Grant calls out now. The timing for this group is a little bit off in that most things close in the next month or so. But in addition, the Pacific States Marine Fish Commission had 2 grant proposals out, one which is just about to close and one which has closed. There's also small business innovative research grants that are being put out, and then we're seeing a number of other agencies jumping on the bandwagon, most notably the Department of Energy, which put $25 million into seaweed aquaculture just recently. The FFAR, which is it's a group of USDA, has funded $5 or $6 million. So there are other groups now that are seeming to be wanting to fund aquaculture.
Richard?
So are you pursuing any kind of a policy to prohibit the use of non-native fish for these facilities?
We don't have anything going on to prohibit non-native fish. It's not really in our purview to do that. We had that in the Gulf Fisheries Management Council, but that got struck down by the courts, so we'll see.
Well, who would make the consideration in Oregon if somebody wanted to farm Atlantic salmon?
It'd be the state.
So the state's responsible for it.
So thank you for the presentation. Thanks for joining us. I'm ODFW, Fish and Wildlife. And so I did want to follow up on Shelby's comment about the Shellfish Initiative, that even though we don't have a policy document that says Oregon Shellfish Initiative, we do have legislators and agencies that are continuing to move forward some of those projects. And in this session in particular, we have House Bill 2574, I believe, which is three or more projects out of the Shellfish Task Force recommendations. And then the OAH Council that Shelby and I are both part of, as well as Andy, I'm probably forgetting somebody else, have supported and used those recommendations within our own report and recommendations. And so that's alive and well. It's just we don't have the Shellfish Initiative. And so I think that's something to be proud of, that we had that discussion, we set those goals, and we're continuing to move forward with ways of trying to implement those. And then a question for you. I think that most of what you presented was aquaculture in support of human consumption of product. I don't recall you saying something, I may have missed it, about algae phytoplankton for fuel sources, which has kind of come and gone as a blip, and I'm just personally interested. Is that still a going concern? Is that still something people are trying to develop?
Yeah, so we don't, so there's, algae comes in 2 forms, right? It's macroalgae or seaweed, and then it's the microalgae, which is typically grown in land in big tanks. We don't really have anything in the land-based microalgae side, except for our Milford lab retains a microalgae collection and does courses in microalgae culture for shellfish hatchery production, so geared toward that. Department of Energy still very much does put in money toward algae In this year's Farm Bill, algae was finally considered a crop, so now it is eligible for a number of USDA programs and funding areas, and USDA's RPE, which is a kind of a special unit of Department of Energy that's more of like a venture capital, very quick lending group, just put out 24 million for seaweed, with the idea that it would be at a scale to eventually get to biofuels. We don't, and NOAA don't really look at the end use as much. We have supported algae farm, seaweed farm growth a lot through the SBIR program, through research, directed research, and SK programs. Also, Sea Grant has had a lot of work in the Northeast on algae, especially the UConn, University of Connecticut folks, and University of Maine folks up there. So it's still out there. And I just to mention also, the algae project in Puget Sound is not really considering the product at all. It's really to look at mitigating ocean acidification, so it's totally not focused on seafood.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we're, I don't see any other comments, but we're really grateful that you drove, flew, all the different modes of transportation you took to get here.
Hitchhike.
Yeah, hitchhike. And so thank you for coming and taking the time to, like I said, start our aquaculture discussion and investigation and learn more. I think you gave us a lot of good tips and places that we can follow up for not only additional information, but additional learning from other states and things. So thank you.
My pleasure. Just one other thing I forgot. Through the NOS work, they are coming out later this month with a marine spatial analysis tool for the entire EEZ, which will be applicable to aquaculture siting and analysis, but also anything you do in the ocean. It's not just for aquaculture. Keep an eye out for that.
Thank you very much. So we were scheduled for a break right now for the next 4 minutes, but I'm going to propose, unless you want to stand up, that we just keep going.